to Grace with Nina Michelle at NRB. We are currently on Frank's Speech Live, and so what an honor to be on the program today. I'm Michelle Humphreys.
And I am Nina Keegan. We are so grateful. We just love Horizon Media Studios, Overcomers TV, and Frank's Speech. And today we have a wonderful guest. He just happens to be my husband. It is Dr. Richard Klucznik. And, you know, we all know that there's waiting rooms all over the world with people who are praying for loved ones who are in surgery or who are in the hospital. And we all know that God also uses physicians when people need help, and God answers prayers through the hands of skilled physicians.
Amen. And today we have one of the nation's top docs. We're not just saying that because he's Nina's husband, but he really is one of the nation's top docs. He is the president of the Society for Neurointerventional Surgery, which is for the entire nation, and he also works for one of the biggest and largest cutting-edge hospitals in America. And so, Dr. Richard Klucznik, we so welcome you to the program. We're so grateful for you. And do you know that Dr. Richard Klucznik has worked on over 30,000 patients, and he is a doctor that will pray with his patients and has just saved so many lives. So welcome to our broadcast live. We appreciate you being here. Now, you are an expert, the leading expert on strokes in America. Tell us what are the signs of stroke and what is the impact of stroke?
First of all, what is a stroke?
Well, first of all, a stroke is two types of stroke, but a stroke is anything that's affecting the blood supply or affecting the brain. The first type of stroke that we deal with mostly is, we call it a bland stroke. That's when a clot breaks free from either the heart, sometimes from the leg, and goes through the heart, or from the vessels down in the neck and goes up into the brain and blocks flow. That's a stroke. That's a blood clot that we try to go and get out. The other type of stroke is a hemorrhagic stroke, which is caused from a vascular problem of the brain. Aneurysms that rupture, arteriovenous malformations, or vascular problems that rupture. There's been lots of cutting edge things that have happened in the last 30 years or so. Just to give you an example, most aneurysms of the brain 35 years ago were operated on. They cut your head open, they took out a piece of the skull, they lifted up the brain, they put a clip on it. Well, now most aneurysms in this country now are done by what we do, is minimally invasive techniques. We go inside the blood vessels and go up and fill it with either platinum coils or fancy stents. So we take care of it from going inside the brain, so you don't have to open the skull, as we kind of say funningly, laughingly. Once air touches the brain, it's never the same. So you don't really want to have to crack the head open if you can avoid cracking the head open. But the biggest advance has been in stroke therapy in the last, say, 8-9 years, where there were new devices that came out and new technologies, and then studies came out that we can go inside blood vessels and grab the clot or suck the clot. There's actually a catheter that's like a vacuum cleaner. Mm-hmm. So either one of these devices came in and you can grab it or suck the clot out. And that just changed everything at that moment. And now we're able to get to people who are having strokes within 6 hours, and you can reverse the stroke. Even if you don't reverse it, you can actually get it to a point where they can recover from the stroke where they couldn't do it before.
Go ahead.
Oh, then also recovering from a major surgery of cutting open the skull and the head, and imagine the recovery time on that. And it's just a minimal recovery time, is it not, for what you're doing?
For an aneurysm of the brain that I can treat, they can go home the next day. Whereas if you have to have surgery, you're in the hospital a week, 10 days or more. And then for regular strokes that we can get the clot out, we've changed it. Now, stroke is the number one leading cause of death and disability in the country, even to this day. And now it's disability, because the stroke can lead to long-term nursing care, Families have to take care of patients. Everybody, I think, knows or have family members that have strokes, and
Right.
they can't move, they can't talk, they can't feed themselves. And we've changed that so much now that patients are going home and they're not ending up in long-term facilities anymore. They're recovering faster. They're recovering better than we ever could before.
Right. Well, I know when my mother-in-law had a stroke, my husband and I were actually talking to her, and all of a sudden she didn't make sense. It was like she was speaking gibberish. And so we were able to get her help. So what are the signs that someone is having a stroke that loved ones should look for? Because at the point where someone is having a stroke, they cannot communicate any longer. So what are the signs?
We teach everybody and family members, and we do teaching across the country too, is to remember this simple word: fast. Fast, F-A-S-T. Face, because if you're talking to a loved one or you're looking at them and their face begins to droop, or you see changes in their eye or side of the face drooping, that's a sign of a stroke. Mm-hmm. We say arm because they're weak. If simple little things like you notice they may not be able to pick up a coffee cup normally or a glass. They can't pick up a glass and take a sip. That's a sign. And then strength, again, arm or length. You may be walking with them and they may be all of a sudden they're going off to a side, or they can't keep up and they're weak, their legs. And then, of course, time, because time is brain. Every minute that the blood supply is not to the brain, millions of neurons are dying. So we have to get to these clot and get it out as fast as we can. So fast is the mnemonic that we use. And even in the area of COVID, we've been teaching, because people are not checking on their loved ones. You may not have that coffee with your loved one in the morning, or you may not go for lunch with your grandmother. But you may call them. We are encouraging people to check on their loved ones more on the phone, because you may not be seeing them, but call them. And if they're not answering the phone, that tells you something. But if they're talking, like you say, they're on the phone and they're starting to speak gibberish, then call 911.
Right. Well, how would you say that COVID affects people in strokes? Is there a correlation?
Well, let me just back that up again one more time with the fast, because you're saying those things, but also, is there anything like immediately when those things are happening, what should they do? And I know that you've talked about how an ambulance is supposed to take you to the closest hospital, but many of those are not going to be a level 1 stroke center. And so explain what the difference is. So if they are experiencing the fast, those types of symptoms, what should somebody do?
Well, of course, you have to call 911. And we have been working as a society, and we're working with another, we hired a program called Get Ahead of Stroke. Get Ahead of Stroke. Mm-hmm. And in the last few years, we have been going to Washington, D.C., and I make the trip with the board of directors of the society. And we actually go talk to senators and congressmen, and we do have to do it state by state, because you can't do it federal. We're changing the laws, because right now, as you said, if an ambulance picks you up, they'll bring you to the closest hospital.
Right.
We're teaching and trying to teach all the emergency medical technicians, all the EMTs across the country, to learn the signs of a stroke, and then make it law that if you think it's a stroke, you bypass the closest place.
Right.
And we have a system and a network of comprehensive strokes, similar to what we have for level 1 trauma centers. Everybody knows if you're in a bad accident and the helicopter comes, they're not taking you to the local place. They're taking you to the level 1 trauma center.
Right.
So we're working basically with all the societies and legislatures to make it law that ambulances have to go to a comprehensive or primary stroke center, comprehensive stroke center, level 1 stroke center, rather than the closest place, so they can get the treatment that we offer, is to get that clot out. Because time is brain. If you go to a local hospital first, and they get a CAT scan, and then they're trying to make a diagnosis. That takes an hour, 2 hours, 3 hours go by. Then they say, oh, this is a stroke, let's transfer. Another 2-3 hours go by. Next thing you know, we can't get that clot out anymore, because the earlier you get it, the easier it is to get out, and the earlier you get it, the better the recovery is. So there's a lot of things going on across statewide, but you're right. We have to, speaking of that, Pat Robertson had a stroke. That's not a secret. But his family knew to take him to a comprehensive stroke center. Not the years. They took him to a comprehensive stroke center, and he got the clot busting drug, TPA, within a short amount of time, and he was able to recover.
Right, and be back on TV internationally within a short amount of time.
Yeah, you were able to go on the CBN 700 Club and talk to him about what happened with strokes and to teach people. But also, so right now, since that's not the law, that, you know, the ambulances are required still to take you to the nearest hospital. So it's better that if you can put your loved one in a car and drive them yourself, if you happen to know, right? Isn't that
Yes.
And to find out, how do you find out what hospitals, what facilities near you are a level 1 stroke center? Is there like a list or a...
There is a list. First, I was the president of the Society of Neurointerventional Surgery. That website, snis.org, lists the doctors in each state by state, to do what we do. So you can do that and plan. You can plan ahead of time. And I urge education for people who have older parents and grandparents to look that up and know that there are people and which hospitals they're at. And the Get Ahead of Stroke program lists the comprehensive stroke centers by state by state by state. So those two are good sources of information to find out where the good centers are.
To know where they are in your area too, to make sure that you know and you can find out.
Yes.
So because that's so important, because you said time is brain. And so it is so important to know those places. So you're saying it's better to actually have your loved one. You can take them if you can somehow manage them and get them in the car. That's better for them for you to drive them.
Yes,
yeah.
I've known of people who had called me, and they were down south, like Victoria, Texas, and they just called and said, "Well, we have a loved one. We're going to take them to that hospital." And I said, "No, don't. Drive to the hospital. Drive to our hospital here, our emergency room." And by the time they got to our emergency room, they were getting worse. But we saved a whole bunch of time. We were able to get the clot out and save that person just because of that alone.
And I think with any type of illness like that, an emergency, going to a trauma center is always best. So you need to have sort of a strategy in place with your family as to where you're going to go. I know one of my dearest friends lost her mother because they took her, she was having a simple asthma attack, and they took her to a women's hospital, where they deliver babies, and she died in the ER. And so having a plan in place for your family is so very important. And, if time is brain, what are some things that people can do to prevent stroke?
It's kind of the simple things in life, don't smoke, don't drink.
Yeah.
A lot of it is diet. We say the Bible Belt in the South, but it's actually probably the worst diet in the whole entire country is in the South. And
that's true.
We're in Texas, and we love barbecue, but it's probably not the greatest thing to be eating a whole bunch of barbecue.
Grease, deep fried.
Eat seafood.
We like fried
basically
anything.
Diet, take care of yourself. If you have high blood pressure, you're being seen by a doctor. Diabetes is a big one. Diabetes causes stroke. So all of those are simple things to do to try to prevent stroke and try to stay healthy. Exercise, be healthy. Simple, common sense kind of things. And you did mention COVID. What we found out in the COVID pandemic is that COVID causes strokes. We saw an increase in strokes because COVID causes problems with bleeding. It causes hypercoagulation, which means it causes thrombus formation. We first found out that it was in the lungs, clots in the lungs, and we start seeing clots in other parts and other parts of the brain that we don't normally see clots, and then strokes. The incidence of strokes went way up during the COVID pandemic just because it is a disease that seems to form clot.
So also heart issues, because if you're having a heart, I know you've talked about it. I feel like being your wife, I have learned so much. It's great. It's like I have this whole new knowledge about doctors, hospitals, different things that cause things, and the things that he does in treatment. It's pretty astonishing. All the time I'm hearing new things. But doesn't your heart, like having an irregular heartbeat, throw clot and cause that too? I know you've talked about that different times. Like,
Yes, one of the big causes of stroke is atrial fibrillation. Your heart, especially the atria of your heart, we say fibrillation, they're kind of not really beating in sync. They're kind of doing this with your hand, like a seizure. And that, because there's no regular beat, clot can form. And when the clot forms on the heart, it's got no place else to go. The first thing that shoots off from the heart is the brain. It doesn't even go down to the legs, or it can, but the first place is upstream to the brain. So atrial fibrillation, clot problems, any kind of problem with a rhythm of a heart. And we've been finding that patients have been coming in now, because we're seeing more in the pandemic with COVID too, that people who have not had diagnosis of heart problems, these are new problems that they hadn't been seen by a doctor. They hadn't been diagnosed with atrial fibrillation. But all of a sudden, they come into the emergency room, they come up to see us, and their heart is in an irregular rhythm. So it is a big thing for strokes.
and also, isn't there, I know that when you were talking with Pat Robertson, wasn't there something to do with, like, if you're on some kind of blood thinners, if you take that regularly, and then if you stop that, there's like a more of a chance of a stroke?
Yes, yeah, we
The
normally
statin drugs.
any kind of blood thinners that people on. Some people are on blood thinners for their heart, and I just know of even people that are on. Anybody's got a stent anywhere in their body. A lot of heart stents out there. So stents in the heart or legs, kidneys, they belong on dual antiplatelets. So they belong on blood thinners. Aspirin, Plavix is the common drug. And we know that people just suddenly don't feel like taking it anymore. And they come then next, if it's other problems, but they're coming into the emergency room and we're seeing them because now they have a stroke because they stopped taking the drug. And a lot of times it's also cost, because Plavix is now cheaper, but when it was newer drug, it was cost, and people would stop taking it because, oh my God, it cost me so much to take medications.
Right.
And that's why, we need to get pharmaceutical costs down so people don't stop taking their blood thinners. But it is a problem. If you stop taking your blood thinner, you can end up with a stroke.
And see, that's very important, because a lot of people might just think, oh, I'm fine now because my blood pressure is fine, and they don't really even realize that by taking that off, that causes your blood that's been running thin to be thicker now. That's going to throw clot.
That's correct.
So, that is so important to make sure that if you are on something like that unless you are doctor supervised or replacing that drug with something or whatever the case may be, to not go off of that.
Correct, yes.
So
One thing I love about Dr. Klucznik is that he is a man of God. And like I said at the beginning of the program, he has worked on 30,000 patients, around 30,000 patients. So tell us a time when you just had to call on the Lord because you didn't know what to do, and it worked out.
Well, I'll give you sort of my own little journey. I was raised Catholic, so previously, when patients would say, "Can we pray with you?" and stuff, I'd be like, "No, no." But once I was saved, and when patients now ask me, and especially families will say, "Can we pray with you?" then I'm happy to. Then I will join in. Then, and I do say every time now, before I work on a patient, I say a tiny little prayer to myself. God, Jesus, please guide my hands. Please let me help this patient. And there are times when I'm in a procedure and something has gone wrong. You can have complications.
Yeah.
The vessels in the head aren't the strongest things in the world. Mm-hmm. Bone. God gave you bone to cover it, protect them. You don't have muscle anymore. So if you're trying to go up and get a clot, you can poke a hole in a blood vessel. Mm-hmm. And I have been in a situation where I've said, God, help me now. I got to do something to save this patient, because I've made it a worse situation right now, and get me out of trouble.
Yeah, and I know so many times.
Tell me what to do. Because
Yeah.
the first thing if you're in trouble and something happens, you may panic and say, but you got to get that panic out of you and say, okay, now what do I do to stop the problem fix the problem and get out of trouble.
And that's the wisdom from the Lord. I know many times you'll text me, I have a very difficult case on the table. Please, say prayers and we'll stand in agreement. And I know that you've said so many times that, this was a very difficult, many of these people are extremely unhealthy. Many of them are very old. And so you are, there's so many factors weighing in on what you're doing. And when you've said so many times, like I was worried about what was going to happen, and then you'll say that you've prayed and that like things started to turn around, and we'll pray for a patient in recovery and they'll just get better. And you've shared so many stories with me, but what are some of the stories where like maybe you've met with a family afterwards and that was praying and stuff? I know you have a lot of those, like where somebody was so thankful.
Well, again, just like I sort of mentioned, I run into trouble and I immediately start praying and God help me out of this, and something will turn around. And I'm always honest with the families. If there's a problem, I go out and talk to them. And I find that if you talk to the family and you tell them the truth and don't try to hide anything, they're happier with anything that happens. But then, I've had them where I thought the patient may end up really dying, and it turns out they didn't. And they turned the corner and healed later, and they were saved, and the family's happy and glad because their loved one who was in trouble made it through.
Yeah.
So you have seen firsthand prayer working in the operating room.
Yes.
Yes, that's amazing. And you're a man of science and a man of faith, and sometimes people think that they cannot mix, but it only makes sense that they do.
Yes, it does.
And so what would you like want people to know? Like, what is like one of the most important things, especially even now with COVID, because some of the issues are coming with younger people. You're seeing some younger people with strokes now too, which didn't really have health issues. They're not elderly, and it's really coming from the clots and the issues from the strokes and some from those different things, and even some of the issues from the vaccines that you've seen happen too. So what are some of those things, like, because people might not be looking at a young person and saying, I think they're having a stroke. That wouldn't be very typical. But you also do a lot of aneurysms and things like that. So what are some of those signs, and what maybe are you seeing with some of the younger people?
Well, for the aneurysms, those are like a blister or a bubble on a blood vessel. Again, your blood vessels are weak in the head because they don't have muscle anymore. So smoking, diabetes, high blood pressure, that constant pulsing on a blood vessel can lead to a blister forming, like a bubble on a tire. And those tend to happen in middle-aged to older patients. So it's very unusual to see them in kids. And again, the treatment is to go inside and fill it with coils, metal, basically make a ball of yarn inside of something, make it stronger. And the first thing you think of as a building, it needs girders. So you put girders inside and make it stronger. And then we have new fancy devices that can help heal the aneurysm in the wall itself. We don't want to get too far ahead of what's going on with vaccines and things, but we do know that there's incidence of myocarditis in young kids, and that incidence is higher than we've ever seen before.
Which is an inflammation of the heart,
Inflammation
right?
of the heart, and we're thinking that may be related to the virus and to the vaccines and the boosters, because there's nothing to explain why we're seeing young kids with heart problems that we never saw before, a higher incidence. And of course, if you have a heart problem, and then that leads to a rhythm problem, well, then you can have other problems like strokes. Never mind just a heart attack and the problem with that, and then congestive failure. And if you're a young person whose heart is failing, then that takes years off your life. You're now living with a heart that's older than the rest of your body. So we don't want to get too far into all of that because we don't have all the data yet, but there's some thought processes about that.
Now, when it comes to, you hear doctors say, take an aspirin. Does that work for strokes?
Yes.
Or so an aspirin a day really does keep the doctor away?
It can, yes.
Yeah?
Yeah, it thins your blood a little bit. So an aspirin, especially for your heart, really, more your heart than your brain, but all blood vessels that are small, an aspirin does help. And it's a baby aspirin, a small aspirin, not a regular aspirin. Just 81 milligrams, the bare baby aspirin.
So when someone is having a stroke, and now we know if they're having a heart attack, maybe give them an aspirin then, but what about stroke?
Not for a stroke.
That's a no because of the bleeding.
Yes.
Yes.
And you don't want, the aspirin works on certain kind of parts of the cascade for blood thinning, and it's actually a detriment to what we do when we have to go get clot out. Because if we stir up bleeding, then it's going to be worse if you're on aspirin. Mm-hmm. The heart, again, can take it because it's got muscle. So it's rare to kind of poke a hole through a heart vessel. You can put a stent, but the brain, the vessels they don't like it. They don't take a beating very well. So you don't want to be on a blood thinner if you don't have to be.
Okay, so now before we were talking about that if you're on a blood thinner and you go off, that is a big red flag for people who are can cause a stroke. So does it work the same way with aspirin? No,
because aspirin is a smaller kind of, but we're talking about the prescription blood thinners that doctors put you on. The Xareltos, the Coumadin, the warfarins, the Plavix, Brilintas, the stronger ones that doctors prescribe. Those are the ones you don't want to stop unless a doctor tells you to.
So if you're on one of those, I know my grandmother, she was 97 when she died. She never took any medications whatsoever except a bufferin, a aspirin, and she took one every single day, and she thought that was the best thing ever, and she was always fine. And so if somebody is like that, if they're on some kind of, they just take one every day, like as a therapy or as a preventative, so they're going to be okay if they forget a day or two or they don't take it, so that's not going to be a big deal.
No.
Okay.
And just overall brain health. What is something that the audience can do now for their overall brain health?
Be active every single day and do anything you can to keep your brain moving, especially as you get older. I mean, you can do anything, puzzles, anything that keeps your brain constantly. The worst thing you don't want to do is just sit down and watch TV. You want to keep your brain functioning. So anything that will keep
Unless you want to watch Jeopardy.
Unless you want to watch Jeopardy, exactly. Or Sudoku, or puzzles, or there's anything like that your brain has to solve a problem is what your brain needs.
Keep learning, because your brain.
Keep learning.
Keep reading.
Reading, learning, anything.
Read the Word of God. Memorize scriptures. Keep your brain going and keep yourself healthy that way. Now, always learn something new, right? They say, I remember when my kids used to come home from school and be like, what did you learn today? Nothing. They would always say nothing. But it's like, maybe try to learn something every day. Maybe a scripture, because that's going to keep your brain active too.
There's one other new kind of thing that we have for stroke right now that's coming into fruition. It's called a mobile stroke ambulance. So now there are ambulances that actually have a CAT scanner on them.
Oh, wow.
So instead of going to get a patient and trying to make a diagnosis of a stroke and bringing them back to an emergency room and then putting them in a scanner to see if there's bleeding or whatever, the scanner comes to them. So the call goes out, they go to the house, they put the patient in the ambulance, scan the patient, you make the diagnosis, the images come back to the medical center, and then you go from there. So it saves time that way. Mobile stroke
wonderful.
scanners are coming.
And now, how soon are those coming?
They're here. There's one in Houston right now.
Wow. Okay. So are those, are there plans that you know of to get those like nationwide?
Yes. Yeah. Cleveland, most of the larger cities have a mobile ambulance. I know some cities in Germany have mobile stroke ambulances.
Wow. Just amazing information, isn't it?
Yes, it is. And it's cutting edge. And, everybody needs to think about their brain health, right?
That's
and everybody needs to maybe know a lot of these things that they didn't know before, to be able to be proactive, to be able to take care of things, to know the difference. If there's any kind of difference that you feel in yourself, that you may, isn't it like balance is kind of an issue too, if you kind of are having balance issues? Any
balance problems, that goes along with face, arm strength, but any imbalance issues can also, I know there's kind of one story where the family noticed that their beloved one just started walking and it was like bumping up against the wall. They were walking,
Oh,
but they
wow.
were bumping and moving along the wall. They were still talking fine. And they said, "What are you doing?" He goes, "I don't know." But they were walking against the wall instead of walking a straight line. So any of those kind of things are worrisome for a stroke.
Yeah. That's why it's always good to keep up with your loved ones and to be checking on them. And so we are so grateful to have you on here. It's just amazing for me to be able to
Thank you.
interview my husband. I'm always so proud of him and all that he is doing through God, right? Because apart from God, we can do nothing.
Well,
but we can do all things through him.
And I'm more proud of you because you save many more people than I do.
No, I can't save anybody. It's Jesus, right? Right. So we just only preach the gospel, and Jesus does the saving. He draws all
Amen.
men to himself. So we just thank you so much for
Thank
joining
you.
us and for getting the word out, and we hope that blesses. Is there, again, you want to say the website of where they could get information about?
It's snis.org, and it's Get Ahead of Stroke. I think it's GAOS.org, but Get Ahead of Stroke, those two places list the doctors and they list the hospitals that deal with this.
Very good. Very
Well, we
important
hope
stuff.
this helps you, and thank you so much for joining us. And thank you for
Thank you.
joining us.
Thank
God
you.
bless
Love
you.
y'all. God bless
Thank you.
Celebrate what Jesus is doing throughout the nation and rise up to answer his call on your life. To serve the poor, heal the broken, free the captives, and bring joy to those in need. Find hope, encouragement, and motivation through Overcomers TV. This inspiring network features everyday people and ministries across America who are putting God's love in action. Tune in to Overcomers TV on your favorite app or streaming platform. It's time to overcome.